On Tuesday morning, Donald Trump sat for a CNBC interview and announced the United States military had just intercepted what he called a gift from China. He was referring to a vessel boarded by U.S. Special Operations Forces in the Gulf of Oman, allegedly carrying chemical components intended for Iranian ballistic missiles. Trump played the moment off casually, stating he thought he had an understanding with President Xi Jinping. But what the cameras didn't show you is the reality unfolding directly underneath that political soundbite. Right now, the United States is enforcing a total naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. And right now, Beijing is actively and deliberately testing it. China's foreign ministry has officially declared the blockade dangerous and irresponsible. And maritime tracking data shows Chinese-linked vessels are not turning around. In this breakdown, we are going to look past the political theater and map out the exact tactical reality on the water. By the end, you will understand what that intercepted gift actually was. The hidden strategic reason Trump is downplaying it, and why this specific maritime breach is the real flashpoint of the US-Iran war. To understand the severity of this morning's events, you have to look at the physical geography of the interception. We are not talking about the open ocean. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most compressed, highly monitored bodies of water on Earth. At its narrowest point, it is just 21 miles wide. But the actual shipping lanes, the deep water channels required to move massive commercial and industrial vessels, are only 2 miles wide in either direction. That is the choke point. That is where the United States Central Command has established its wall of steel. When U.S. forces executed a visit board search and seizure operation, a VBSS, on this vessel in the Gulf of Oman, they were operating inside a powder keg. Armed Americans boarding a foreign-linked deck in contested waters is an act that, under different circumstances, triggers immediate military retaliation. Yet, the President of the United States went on financial television and called this grave tactical escalation a gift. Why use that specific word? In geopolitical analysis, rhetoric is rarely an accident. It is a diffusion mechanism. By framing the intercepted chemical payload as a gift, Trump is deliberately draining the geopolitical tension out of the room. He is downgrading a potential act of war, the arming of a hostile state during a blockade, into a mere diplomatic misunderstanding. But this explanation breaks down for one reason. Donald Trump previously established a severe red line. He threatened a devastating 50% tariff on China if Beijing was caught arming Iran. That was his stated policy. So why, when presented with physical evidence of Chinese-linked chemicals moving toward Iranian ports, did he not drop the tariff hammer? I will explain exactly why he cannot afford to trigger that economic weapon right now. And it has everything to do with a specific date in mid-May that is forcing Washington's hand. But first, we have to look at what was actually inside the hull of that ship. While the White House attempted to keep the exact nature of the cargo vague, the information did not stay hidden. Former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley took to social media, bypassing the Pentagon's carefully curated silence to leak the intelligence. Haley stated that the vessel was carrying chemical components specifically designed for solid propellant ballistic missiles. This detail changes everything. In the world of military logistics, the difference between liquid fuel and solid propellant is the difference between life and death for U.S. personnel in the region. Liquid fuel missiles take hours to prepare, fuel, and launch. That gives U.S. allies time to detect the thermal signatures. It gives air defense batteries time to calibrate. Solid propellant missiles are pre-fueled. They can be rolled out of a mountain bunker and fired in minutes. By intercepting chemicals meant for solid rocket motors, the U.S. Navy didn't just stop a generic weapons shipment. They intercepted the exact components Iran needs to close the kill chain against American warships. So how does a shipment of highly lethal missile precursors end up floating through the Gulf of Oman without triggering massive, immediate global sanctions against Beijing? There is a single heavily exploited legal mechanism that allows this to happen. It is called the dual-use loophole. And it is the hidden mechanism at the center of this maritime shadow war. Chemical precursors for rocket propellant, like ammonium perchlorate or specialized aluminum powders, are not exclusively military assets. They have legitimate, large-scale industrial and agricultural applications. They are used in mining, in mass agriculture, and in commercial manufacturing. When these chemicals are loaded onto a vessel at a Chinese port, the manifest does not say ballistic missile fuel. It says industrial agricultural supplies. This provides Beijing with absolute, ironclad, plausible deniability. If the ship makes it to Iran, the Revolutionary Guard gets their rocket fuel. If the ship is intercepted by the U.S. Navy, Beijing simply claims the Americans are illegally seizing civilian fertilizers and industrial goods. And that is exactly the playbook China initiated. Just hours after the U.S. boarding, Beijing did not apologize. They did not retreat. Instead, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Guo Jiakun stepped to the podium and launched a direct diplomatic counteroffensive. Guo did not bother addressing the specific chemicals. He attacked the legality of the U.S. blockade itself. He called the American chokehold on Hormuz dangerous and irresponsible. He warned that the region was at a critical juncture. Most importantly, he asserted that China has a sovereign, legal right to conduct normal bilateral trade with Iran, regardless of what Washington commands. This is a masterclass in narrative inversion. Guo Jiakun took a U.S. military interception of missile components and instantly reframed it as an American assault on the freedom of navigation. Beijing is using the United States' own historical defense of open seas against them. The public version of this story sounds simple. America sets a blockade, China tries to sneak a ship through, America catches it. But the documented reality on the water does not match that simplicity. The U.S. Navy is undoubtedly catching the shadow fleet, the rusted, aging vessels, flying flags of convenience from nations like Panama or Liberia, operating with their tracking transponders turned off. But the shadow fleet is just the distraction. If you look at the live maritime tracking data in the Arabian Sea right now, a much larger, much more dangerous reality is taking shape. Legitimate, state-backed Chinese commercial vessels are not altering their courses. They are holding their vectors toward the strait. China relies on the Gulf for roughly 40% of its imported oil. Beijing cannot and will not allow the United States to dictate its energy security. They view their 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran as a vital national interest, entirely outside the jurisdiction of U.S. Central Command, which means the U.S. blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is not functioning as a wall. It is functioning as a filter. Right now, the United States is filtering out the dark vessels, the obvious smugglers, and the poorly disguised proxies. But by downplaying the intercepted chemical shipment as a gift, Donald Trump signaled to Beijing that Washington is not ready for a direct state-on-state confrontation over this blockade. And Beijing is calculating its next move based on that exact hesitation. The real test is not a shadow tanker carrying dual-use chemicals. The real test is currently steaming toward the Gulf of Oman. The question is no longer if the blockade will be breached, but what happens when a fully flagged, state-owned Chinese megatanker arrives at the 2-mile choke point and demands the right of passage. To understand why the White House is not enforcing that 50% tariff today, you have to look at the calendar. On May 14th and 15th, Donald Trump is scheduled to sit down with Xi Jinping in Beijing for a highly anticipated bilateral summit. That meeting is the absolute cornerstone of the administration's current macroeconomic strategy. Washington needs that summit to secure vital trade concessions, stabilize global markets, and project diplomatic strength. If Donald Trump drops a devastating tariff hammer on Beijing this morning over a seized shipment of missile chemicals, the May summit evaporates. President Xi would immediately cancel the meeting, recognizing that attending under the threat of direct economic warfare would project weakness to his own domestic base. By enforcing his own red line, Trump would annihilate his negotiating leverage just weeks before he needs it most. Beijing's calculation here is simple ruthless, and highly effective. They recognize that Washington is currently trapped in a summit window. It is a period of artificial diplomatic paralysis where the United States is highly incentivized to ignore minor to moderate provocations to ensure the meeting takes place. China is aggressively exploiting this window to push vital supplies into Iranian ports, while the political cost for America to stop them is artificially inflated. But this structural pressure creates a terrifying dilemma for the United States Navy on the water. You might be asking the obvious question. If the U.S. Central Command knows these vessels are moving lethal, dual-use chemicals, and they know the Shadow Fleet is just a distraction, why doesn't the military simply sink the ships approaching the blockade? The answer lies in the catastrophic fragility of the global supply chain and the specific way Chinese maritime operations are structured. If an American destroyer fires on an aging, unflagged shadow vessel, the geopolitical fallout is minimal. But Beijing is not sending unflagged vessels to test the core of the blockade. They are positioning legitimate, sovereign-flagged commercial megatankers, backed by the state-owned enterprise apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party. Sinking or crippling one of those vessels in the Strait of Hormuz does not just start a shooting war. It immediately spikes global maritime insurance premiums in the Gulf to mathematically impossible levels. Civilian cargo operations would freeze overnight. The price of crude oil would detach from reality, triggering a massive, immediate inflationary shock inside the United States, right, as the administration is trying to stabilize the economy. More importantly, it forces an escalation that the United States is actively trying to avoid. If you listen closely to Guo Jiako's statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, the confidence is unmistakable. He did not issue a panicked denial. He issued a measured, systemic warning. Beijing knows that the Pentagon cannot fight a protracted, multi-domain conflict in the Middle East, while simultaneously triggering a direct naval clash with the People's Liberation Army Navy over a boarded cargo ship. The United States Navy has the firepower to sink anything floating in the Gulf. What they do not have is the political authorization to absorb the global economic collapse that would follow. And this is the exact trap that the blockade has triggered. By drawing a hard line in the Strait of Hormuz, Washington essentially dared the world to cross it. Beijing called the bluff, leveraging the upcoming May summit and the threat of economic contagion as their shield. They sent a vessel carrying the exact solid propellant precursors Nikki Haley warned about, dressed up as agricultural supplies, and dared the White House to blow up the global economy over it. Before we map out the exact trigger points for the next 48 hours and what the U.S. military's fallback plan looks like, if you want clear, uncompromised geopolitical analysis without the partisan noise, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. The immediate forward scenario now hinges on what happens when the current diplomatic ambiguity expires. Washington cannot pretend every intercepted shipment is a simple misunderstanding forever. The dual-use loophole is a temporary bandage on a bleeding geopolitical artery. As Chinese state-backed tankers continue to hold their vectors toward the 2-mile deep water channel of the strait, the American blockade forces will be forced to make a binary decision: step aside and allow Beijing to dictate the flow of maritime traffic to Iran, or physically block a sovereign Chinese vessel and ignite the exact conflict the summit was meant to prevent. Which brings us all the way back to Tuesday morning on CNBC, when Donald Trump went on television and called the intercepted chemical shipment a gift from China. He was not misspeaking. A gift is something you accept willingly. He accepted the breach, rhetorically downgrading it to maintain the illusion of control, because acknowledging it as a targeted, deliberate act of military smuggling would force him to react. The vessel wasn't a gift, it was a stress test of the American security umbrella. Beijing probed the wall of steel in the Gulf of Oman. They measured the political response from the White House, and they realized that, at least for now, the United States is willing to blink. Watch the maritime tracking data over the next 2 weeks. The next ship won't be carrying a test. it will be carrying a mandate.